I actually have a question for both of you.
There's three of us. Which is both?
Amar and you, David, but
Okay.
maybe Ain too, because one of the things you've talked a lot about is structures. We've talked about innovations, we've talked about needs, etc. But one of the things we haven't talked about is what's behind the structures, behind the innovations and all that. And I think, and please tell me if I'm right or not, that there are philosophies, there are cultural issues behind all this that make us who we are or not. For example, if you think about the US versus Europe, and then we'll talk about the US versus the world. The US versus Europe, one of the great things about us here, at least that's what brought me to this country as an immigrant 35 years ago. I've always been with the impression that when a baby is born and his mother gives him the breast, the understanding is very clear. You're going to have to pay for this. This is not a free meal. And you kind of grow up with this notion that whatever you get, there is a cost to it, and you're just going to have to participate in that. In Europe, on the other hand, the concept is very simply that the state is here behind you, you're entitled to everything, and so there is no great sense of direct personal responsibility. That has been one of the things that I think has made America different. Unfortunately, it's eroding. And I think this is one of the main issues that we have right now, whether it's in the financial services or whether it is in social issues in general, where you have people who already have a whole bunch of kids and who can't afford to have these kids, making even more kids. So, I mean, it's one of the issues. The second issue that I would say America versus the world is that we have a certain concept of freedom, of democracy, of, if you want, sharing the wealth. I don't like this term, but of spreading the wealth, where the way we look at the world is there's a wide range of people out there. That's a market. And we want to try to tap into this market and build it up. And so we want everybody to have an iPhone or to have a car or to have a computer, etc., etc. The rest of the world looks at the high class and says, yes, they're entitled to all this stuff, but the poor people, why do they need this stuff? Let them live in ignorance. And so they don't do anything to let them live in ignorance, let them live in hunger. This way, we can afford 20 servants. We can afford to pay people in $5 a day in the factory, if that much, etc., etc. Very, very fundamental different concept. And I think this comes to fundamental philosophical differences that are behind all this. So to make a long story short, as long as we can maintain our philosophies, I think we will have extra innovation, we will have extra wealth, we will stay ahead of the world. If we lose those philosophies, then we will get behind. So I don't know what you think of that.
All right, you want to go first? Well, let me suggest to you that you raised the issue of entitlement. I think that the evidence is overwhelming that the people who have the most entitlement attitude in this country are the very wealthy. We have just spent, depending on how you measure it, as much as $13 trillion to bail out a very narrow segment of the wealthiest people at the top of this country. And we hear constantly this refrain, we can't afford Social Security because someone does a net present value chart of the future costs of Social Security. Well, you know what? We can't afford public education anymore either, because if you do the same chart of public education, you'll come to the same conclusion. Trillions and trillions of dollars of liability for children who are yet to be born to be educated. This is absolute nonsense. What I have documented in my books, and I'll tell you one thing about writing for the New York Times, there are people who write in and complain about commas. Okay? The White House, the Bush White House in particular, was very policing of the news. 4 years ago in the New York Times, we ran a huge page-sized chart. You can still see it if you go to nytimes.com/class and day 9, the hyper-wealthy. People in this country who make $50,000 to $75,000 a year pay the same share of their income in total federal taxes as people who make over $100 million a year. I have a chart in tax notes this week, which I write a column for. If you make $26,000 a year, your tax burden, that is the share of your income, the percentage of it that you must by law give up to the government. If you make $26,000, it is 1/4 higher than if you make $266 million, the average income of the top 400 taxpayers. We have a socialist redistribution system in the United States that provably, I've written 2 books and no one has challenged my data, takes from the poor, the middle class, and the rich, the moderately rich, people like me, and turns that money over to the super rich in this country. Donald Trump, $89 million from a tax levied to help the poor. Jack Welch gave up when I revealed the economics of his retirement perks, what they were. They were a redistribution system that took from the company. Warren Buffett, $670 million interest-free loan, only half of which is due in 31 years. Now just think about that for a second. Imagine if you bought a house 31 years ago, paid no mortgage payments, and this year had to pay half the number of dollars, forget inflation, you agreed to pay 31 years ago. That deal alone would make you prosperous. Rules under which you pay to monopolies, like electric companies, the income taxes they pay, and they never pay the money to the government. Not they phantom delay it. I proved, ran on the front page of the New York Times, and the industry did not challenge what I reported, that these companies had figured out how to capture that money, which means that they're earning an unjust and unreasonable profit. And by the way, in Oregon, where they passed a law to stop this, because that's where I first exposed this, the story in the Times about utilities out there, because Enron owned the Portland General Electric Company, Warren Buffett is fighting to keep that money, to make sure that he can pocket your tax dollars. So we have an incredible entrepreneurial spirit and business spirit in this country. Okay, and I'm a good example of that. I'm a perfect example of somebody who came from poverty and is a wealthy person, and who has not just been a journalist but run businesses, little businesses for sure. But I have right now 25 employees in my largest business, and but we've created a system that is taking from those with less to give to those with more. And I'll tell you philosophically what happens to that, because boy, one thing Amar and I see eye to eye on is it's liberal arts education is what we need to be providing people with. Learn how to learn. A college education should demonstrate not that you know history, science, or engineering, but that you know how to learn and how to take on a project now and way down the road fulfill that project, and that you have the tools to acquire more knowledge. But we need to create a society that rewards people who are innovators and strivers, and but we will end up with a revolution in this country if we continue down the path we're going down, which is taking from those who less to give more. And what the Bible says is that if you do this, your society will come to ruin, and the Bible describes this several dozen times and repeatedly describes this practice with a single, very clear, unambiguous word: evil.
I think, you know, in the book, in Amar's book, Amar, you make the comparison between kind of 19th century and the 20th century and a broader participation. And you know, really, how can we, your model describes so well this mechanism that we've had here. How can we keep this going? Do you see any contradictions?
You know, you can look at the glass as half full or half empty.
Yeah.
And I prefer to see the glass as being at least half full, not without problems, but at least half full. And I think it's important in looking at a situation to distinguish between the real problems which are worth attacking and the problems which are pointless. So I had the good fortune while I was still writing the introduction to say, don't worry about what your friend Thomas Friedman sort of freaks out about, this China and India catching up. Worry about the financial system. Which, if Tom had spent half the time he spent sort of banging on about globalization onto the things that matter, So there are. So I'd say that our system is largely right. We don't need a revolution in the system.
But also our culture.
Our culture is also largely in good shape. The issue of entitlement is not extraordinarily widespread. It may have sort of percolated. I despair about my daughter, but you know, all parents despair about their children. It's sort of like my parents used to think we were soft. So this sort of goes on. But you know, the problem of inner cities is a real problem. The problem of bad K through 12 education and for large segments of the population is a real problem. The misregulation of the financial system is a real problem. But let's just focus on these pathologies and not, I mean, so the way I like to think about it is that the car isn't totaled. There's a problem with the transmission, and let's focus our energies on those parts which need fixing.
Anya, you'd like to add something?
Yeah, you know, I hate to come across as the Eurocentric person in the room and to be defending Europe, but you know, I mean, I immigrated here for a reason. I actually think America works really well, but the fact of the matter is that it would be misleading to think of Europe and Europeans as being entitled. Some of them are, but the fact of the matter is that those systems that you have in places like Scandinavia and Northern Europe, you pay for. You pay decent taxes, and then you get a system that you're entitled to use. There's no stigma about it. There's no shame. Not in places like Scandinavia. The rest of Northern Europe wouldn't be as good as Scandinavia. But the fact of the matter is that per capita, if you live in a country like Norway, you don't get richer. You know, granted they have their own oil, but the way that the country is set up rewards people for participating in society. Yeah, they have high taxes, but they also have a system that pays them back. And I wouldn't consider that entitlement. I would agree that the greatest example of entitlement I have ever seen is amongst the wealthy in this country. I mean, we talk about personal responsibility, and it's funny, the idea has come up now twice about poor people walking around with iPods. If only that were the greatest crime here, you know. The fact of the matter is that you have poor people walking around with iPods for a reason. They're walking around with iPods because this is a country that considers it innovative to promote consumerism, right? It is patriotic in this country to go out and spend money. It is unpatriotic to save it. The entire economic stimulus bill was based on that. And what's more than that, that philosophy has spread across the world into Europe. You now have countries that rank fairly high in the innovation scale of late. Places, not the usual suspects in Europe, not Germany, not Britain, but the smaller countries like Finland, for example, that are considered very innovative or were prior to last year. They're suffering now too, because they've invested in technology and research, and they have invested in education in general to bring sort of the general population up to a particular standard, and emerged onto the global market. But you now have ads in Finland, the like of which have never existed there, where you have pictures of piggy banks literally axed out, saying this is not the way to stimulate the economy, spend. Now, that's a message straight out of the US that didn't exist in countries like that before. And that's also the reason I mentioned earlier that we used to have an elderly population that saves money. We don't have them anymore, right? My generation doesn't save, the generation behind me doesn't save, and the baby boomers, well, here's the situation with them. Many of them couldn't save because they didn't earn enough money, and the ones who were saving, a lot of them had their savings wiped out in this current global crisis, and they don't have enough time left to recover. So we have a baby boomer generation. Again, it's quite large in size. They're aging in without savings. Their incomes will drop, and they're already experiencing difficulty making ends meet. And they will be our burden. And we don't have a system in place. We don't have a structure in place to support them, right? So, you know, but we'll only expect them to be personally responsible if they're poor. We won't expect them to be personally responsible if they're rich. If you're rich in this country, If you're rich in this country, they should. But if you're rich in this country, you will be rewarded by what we consider corporate welfare.
Which is wrong too.
But we won't frown on that as much as we will frown on social welfare.